Good afternoon. Hello. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our participants who are here with us in person, and also to those who have dialed in from all over the globe to participate in today's panel. Let me also thank our moderator and our panelists who will be participating in the conversation today. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us. First, let me also thank the Nasdaq Entrepreneurial Center for hosting us this afternoon. This is a beautiful space. We are especially privileged because it hasn't actually opened yet, so we're getting a sneak preview. We're able to avail of the fantastic services that they will be offering the community as they open their doors tomorrow, with some very exciting events planned around that. So thank you to the Nasdaq Entrepreneurial Center. The Nasdaq Entrepreneurial Center is a very interesting place. I got a tour this afternoon, got to meet one of the individuals who will be availing of it with her business. Over the next year, they will be supporting over 2,000 aspiring entrepreneurs, helping them get their businesses off the ground and to make them successful. And as Thomson Reuters, we're especially pleased to be able to partner with Nasdaq in supporting those entrepreneurs with access to some patent analytics information, as well as some trademark screening tools. So we're very pleased and excited to see that begin to take off over the next several months. Before we get into the conversation, I wanted to talk a little bit about the context for us as IP and science, intellectual property and science, the division of Thomson Reuters that I work for and that my colleagues here today are part of. Our mission is to accelerate the pace of innovation. I recognize that's lofty, but as we think about that today, and think about how technology is changing innovation, how it's defined, how products are brought to market, how science is evolving, how data are managed. We're really committed to using technology and working with all sectors of the innovation lifecycle in how we support their information needs, how we use technology to bring those needs, those information and analytics and insights tools to them in more efficient and more interesting ways. And we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of the discussion today. I think in the life sciences, the theme that we'll be focusing on this afternoon, those changes, those technological advances or inputs into the science research and development process are really enabling us to, if you will, shorten the path from science to development, or from bench to bed in the clinical setting. So I'm really excited to hear from all of our panelists about your innovation journeys, and to begin a conversation with all of you here and online with us as we go forward on this journey. So thank you for coming, and over to Michael.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Fitzhugh. I'm a staff writer for BioWorld, a Thomson Reuters publication that covers the business, financial, clinical, scientific, and regulatory aspects of innovative drug development. We're here, I think, to both recognize and foster your role in open innovation and to encourage and support your work as well. We're at a unique juncture in which life sciences development is evolving from a siloed, static, and flexible world, static, and flexible model, rather, built around dynamic and increasingly diverse clusters to one that's built around dynamic and increasingly diverse clusters of talent. The new model is both anchored and set free by the traditions of academic inquiry, focused on with new intensity by our need for improved drugs, devices, energy, tangible outcomes of basic research. We're moving away from a narrative that's driven by fears about scarcity and innovative pipeline assets and commercial losses created by patent expirations to one in which we're writing a narrative of places where we can find, establish, refresh, sustain clinical ties between you and your colleagues. The story, I think, that we're writing is taking place in innovation centers, R&D hubs, and through regional and global partnerships. These are all established in response to an awareness that industry doesn't have some sort of special claim on access to innovation, that it needs contributions from many quarters to meet market needs. Examples of these efforts are certainly familiar to many of you. There's the Energy Biosciences Institute in Berkeley, the largest public-private partnership of its kind, created to apply advanced biological knowledge in the area of bioenergy development and funded by over 10 years for $500 million and more. Innovative Medicines Initiative in Europe and its latest phase, IMI2, a $3.6 billion public-private research partnership focused on finding next-generation vaccines, medicines, and treatments, and crowdsourcing projects like the AstraZeneca-Sanger Drug Combination Prediction Dream Challenge, which was just announced a couple days ago. It's an effort to inspire researchers from various organizations to find the most synergistic drug combinations for treating cancer. Now, obviously, it's important to take a reality check. There's still lots of open questions about who benefits most from partnerships between industry and academic institutions. Data management, legal, and IP issues can make collaborations more complex than expected. And even when innovative discoveries make it to market, there's often a wide gulf between the value that innovators see and what payers perceive. So I think we're on the right track, though. And I hope that today's panel will provide some useful insights for navigating your own innovation journey. And with that, I want to introduce the panelists. Got here. I'm really fortunate to have an incredible lineup today. I want to start with Albert Cha, Manter. Albert's a managing partner at Palo Alto-based Vivo Capital, where he invests in private and public biopharmaceutical and medical device companies. He's an accomplished scientist with expertise in neuroscience and medical devices, and he was an investor in Septaris Therapeutics, later acquired by
Actelion.
Thank you, Actelion.
You can just cut off the rest of the comments. It's okay.
and all sorts of other wonderful successes. Thanks, Albert. Also, Dr. Gini Deshpande. Dr. Deshpande is founder and CEO of Palo Alto-based Numedii, a company that's using big data to discover and de-risk new indications for safe existing drugs. She helped develop Numedii's core technology, structured critical partnerships, including one with Thomson Reuters' IP and Life Sciences division, and raised the company's initial rounds of financing from leading Bay Area VC firms. Gini has more than 15 years of experience translating cutting-edge life sciences technologies into products and companies. And prior to Numedii, as a consultant, she helped early-stage companies identify optimal markets for their technologies and enabled them to raise more than $25 million in financing. Patrick on Manter. Patrick Heron is a general partner at Frazier Healthcare Ventures in Menlo Park and is co-head of the firm's BioVentures team. 2/3 of Frazier's investments are in seed and Series A financing. So, talk to this guy in the networking or catch him online, like Albert. And they have a strong focus on company creation, so great connection, as are all the panelists. Prior to joining Frazier 16 years ago, he was a McKinsey consultant to Immunex, and which was bought by Amgen, and Agron, which was bought by Park Davis. Dr. Susan Jenkins. Dr. Jenkins is the Energy Biosciences Institute's chief administrator and the Berkeley site's staff manager. She's a key point person for strategic planning and investigating new potential research areas at the Institute, and the chief coordinator of the research proposal process, finance, communications, management, IT, and education and outreach activities. And last but not least, Professor Mike Snyder. Mike is a professor at Stanford University, chair of Genetics and director of the Center for Genomics and Personalized Medicine there. He also co-leads the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine's Genomics Stem Cell Center and has invented many genomics technologies and has co-founded several biotechnology companies, including Protometrics, now part of Life Technologies, Affomix, now part of Illumina, and Personalis. Like me, many of you may have learned of his work at first in developing the IPOP, an integrative omics profile to assess disease risk and monitor disease states for personalized medicine. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to the panelists to tell you a little bit more about themselves and their own innovation stories. I'm going to start with Albert.
Sure. As a medical scientist training in the MD PhD program, my goal was to stay close to innovation while finding a different route to finding ways to use my interest. And maybe the most recent interesting example of a company that we got involved with where there's a lot of innovation, but it also speaks to the challenges of innovation and a willingness to take 2 steps forward with 1 step back, is a company called Regenexx Bio that's in the gene therapy space. Gene therapy was very exciting about 20 years ago and then ran into a huge problem, which some of you may remember, with the patient who died of an immune reaction, Jesse Gelsinger. And the gentleman who was involved with that from the University of Pennsylvania, Jim Wilson, was publicly castigated and one would think would never work in the field again. But his work after that point was focused purely on how to make sure that that wouldn't happen again. And his research pioneering around new adeno-associated viral vectors has pioneered a new generation of therapeutics, which we invested in, and actually just that company that has partnered with him to develop those technologies and develop cures for patients just went public last week in a very successful IPO and captured the public's imagination. So obviously innovation is a long, hard road, but I think the point is in recognizing there can be obstacles, the opportunity on the other end can be quite remarkable.
Mike?
Okay, our lab actually invents many technologies. We've done this for many, many years, and I think the reason we wind up doing it is we always see something that doesn't seem inadequate, that seems inadequate or seems very hard to do, or just there must be a better way. That seems to be the phrase that keeps popping up, and that always leads a new technology, and in many cases, it's the kind of thing I think, well, if we're having trouble doing this sort of thing and here's a solution, this solution would be great for lots of people. And in fact, that's how we tend to spin off the various biotechnology companies we've done. And I think the most recent example would be this very detailed profiling we've been doing on me. I moved from Yale to Stanford 6 years ago. And I remember going into a doctor's office and getting back, they measure a few things, they give you back a report with 15 things on it, and I'm thinking, well, with all the ways we can measure things now, why aren't we looking at thousands, if not tens of thousands of things in people's blood? And in fact, that's what we do now. We do these very detailed profiles. We literally make billions of measurements, and we sample people quite frequently. And one of those measurements is sequencing your DNA and then looking at all your RNA, all your molecules in your blood, basically. And that's how we got started in that. It's led to one company, Personalis, that's involved in genome sequencing, and I see more coming down the road from the various spin-offs of that project.
Susan.
So I'm sort of the outlier on the panel here in that I'm not from the therapeutics area or medical side of things, but I'm the institute that I work with or for is focused on bioenergy, and it's sort of different in that the research that we do is actually funded by BP, the company formerly known as British Petroleum, and they fund the research in its entirety with the hope that over time there could be some discoveries that would lead to things that they would license in-house or could present opportunities for spin-offs for individual companies to launch. So the BP approach to the university about funding the Energy Biosciences Institute about 8 years ago. It's a 10-year agreement. As Michael said, it's the overall amount was $500 million to be spent over that time. And I think the driver for BP was, there's socioeconomic and environmental reasons why they wanted to get into this space, but there was also a financial incentive of a federal mandate for lignocellulosic transportation fuels to become a significant part of our mix. So that was the driver for them. The driver for those on the academic side would be to expand our footprint and our knowledge in the bioenergy space. And the academic partners were Lawrence Berkeley Lab, UC Berkeley, and the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And so that partnership was really key because you can have a lot of the basic research going on, lots of discoveries made along the way, but when you're looking at something that has the scale and the potential, and what's going to be needed there when it comes to energy, that deployment is huge. It's not just a small scale up, it's really changing in a significant way the energy infrastructure, not just in the US, but potentially global as well. So we really needed guidance on the academic side as far as where we should be focusing, what things we were interested in doing at a basic level could really lead to potential commercialization that would have impact and weren't just sort of these pie-in-the-sky ideas that academics thought were really cool. So anyway, it's been a great partnership, and hopefully throughout the questions or afterward in the networking session, we'll be able to share some of what the key innovations were and developments we've come up with.
Great. Ginny.
So when I was finishing up my PhD, the human genome was just being sequenced, and I trained as a classically trained molecular biologist, biochemist, looking at one protein, looking at that being involved in a certain pathway and really trying to understand what that protein did. And then suddenly got exposed to all this information that was coming out. And we started asking the question, well, where else is this protein present? And started looking at different animal species and bacteria and viruses to see if some of this protein was conserved. To better understand what this protein was really doing, it was an unusual phosphatase. And so that sort of gave me an insight into sort of what was going to come next after the human genome had been sequenced. And in parallel, there was a lot of information that was now coming out in the public domain with the use of microarray technology. And just the sheer volume of data that was out there led us to sort of start asking questions of the data. And I collaborated with our co-founder, Atul Butte, to start looking at what can we do with this information, all this molecular information, all this omics information that's coming out on diseases. And his lab was really interested in looking at, can we leverage this information to better classify diseases? And that was an interesting academic exercise. And the entrepreneur in me said, why should I care? So what if a doctor calls one disease by one name and another disease that may be related by a different name? And that's sort of what led to the genesis of Numedii and the concept that you can use data and technology to drive innovation, identify new indications for drugs, because you can look at molecular similarities between diseases and look for shared therapeutic opportunities. And so we're sitting at the cusp of, I think, a very exciting time in our space where there's just a huge amount of information. At one end of the spectrum, you have large collections of data. I mean, you've got Flatiron and you've got Google, which is now getting into genomics. And then you've got, at the individual level, with someone like Mike Snyder collecting every piece of information about themselves, with the quantified self movement that's happening. And how do we as an industry leverage all of this data and information to really drive change, both in terms of how patients are treated, but also in terms of how we expedite drug discovery and development and develop better diagnostics to identify diseases before they manifest. So I'm really excited to see what comes next. And the journey for my company is certainly an interesting one, but the field as a whole is a very exciting space to be in right now.
Patrick.
So, my background is basically on the side of funding companies and putting basically sort of industry together with academia, with an entrepreneur to basically create a spark and make a company happen. And probably the best example of that was a company called Merganser that we funded recently. And this actually came about because Novartis, there was an entrepreneur we worked with, Brian McDonald, who saw a very interesting technology coming out of UCLA and Scripps to basically create a hepcidin analog. And if you could do this and produce it so it's non-immunogenic, it could be very interesting for treating beta thalassemia. And he was able to convince Novartis, their venture fund, to come in and lead the financing And then he was able to sort of put these technologies and the IP estate together to create this new opportunity. And what was fantastic was the actual inventor went in front. It was the plenary session at ASH about how hepcidin analogs could potentially change the treatment paradigm around beta thalassemia. So a lot of what I think about is how you bring together sort of industry, the entrepreneurs, and the academic institution to bring therapies to market faster. And I'm really concerned there's sort of a valley of death where companies, technologies exist in academia that aren't able to, get developed because there isn't adequate funding and we can't fund them. So how do we think about partnering with others to do that? And so that's part of what I like to explore.
So I think that gives us a really fantastic segue into the first thing that I wanted to ask you all about, which is, given the incredible results that can come from coordination of academic and corporate resources, what and the financing that drives all that ahead, I still, every time I research innovation, come up against people saying, oh God, we gotta break down silos. We gotta, figure out how to get people to cooperate. How can we do it? And I've been reading that for a decade now. Why are we still talking about that? I mean, is there still work to be done there? And is technology helping us or hindering us on that road? You think, Ginny? Yeah.
My view on this is I think technology is enabling things, but I think there is a lack of training. So in our particular field, you need people who really understand computational approaches and algorithms, and also need to understand biology. And I think people are not fundamentally trained in two disciplines. We're starting to see that trend emerge now. So I think some of the silos that you're talking about, at least at the very early stages of research or discovery, tend to be because of the lack of the sort of cross-training that's needed. And hopefully that will continue to progress and change, and we'll have more data scientists that are trained who can come in and start to really work with all this data and do things. I think in industry, I think you have silos primarily because of the way drugs are developed, and you have a drug that's focused on cardiovascular, you have a whole team that has deep expertise in cardiovascular disease. They may or may not look across other areas and say, what else can we do? Or is there crosstalk between cardiovascular disease and metabolic disease, or cancer? And so there may be those sorts of silos that are present simply because of the way things have been established and run for so long. And I think innovative approaches and people who are cross-trained in multiple disciplines will help break some of those silos down.
Well, Ginny, it sounds like some of the tools that you're developing are going to break those barriers, right? If you have a molecular pattern of two diseases that are thought to be completely distinct from a physician perspective, but in fact have a similar molecular signature, then you can cause that collaboration to happen where it may not ordinarily do so.
Absolutely, and I think, we're starting to see a lot of crosstalk now between immunology and cancer, which is, immuno-oncology is extremely hot. There's publications that have come out now which talk about the immune system being involved in neurological diseases, which we hadn't fully appreciated before. So you can imagine if you wanted to do something with this information and really leverage it, you need people who can really understand these two spaces extremely well to be able to understand how do you bridge that gap and drive therapeutic development in these two areas. So I think it's, again, all about training, and I think we need people who are trained to think more broadly and take a systems level view of diseases and drug development.
So I'll just add from my perspective from our institute, when BP approached us to establish the institute, they wanted to cover the entire spectrum from the socioeconomics, environmental, as well as the chemical engineering, process engineering that was going to be needed to really come up with a solution. And to do that, you had to break down the silos. You had to have the economists talking to the environmental scientists and to the catalytic chemists. And so one way I think we were able to make that happen was our institute, and this is unique through the UC system. We actually embedded 2 IP managers in the institute and had them sort of serve as a conduit of information between the different groups. They were very much involved. They saw all the invention disclosures and publications and abstracts. And so they could they could keep an eye on where, of 2 groups, maybe a group working on a catalytic process from a biological perspective and another group from a chemical perspective, maybe should be brought into the same room to talk and then educate them about the different approaches and technologies, and why when you're trying to develop a big process that might have some biology up front with some chemistry downstream, how you could understand what the others were, where they were trying to go, and understand their technology and speak their language. So we actually found that our IP team was critical in that.
I think it's also important for just launching of the company. When you get to the point, if you don't have the IP sort of tied up well, that you're going to sort of withstand investor diligence and scrutiny, you're going to be in a really tough situation. And I found there's been a lot more collaboration and thinking about how you get the IP estate built well so the company will continue to have legs, because that's critical for making the funding come in.
I mean, the only thing I would add to that, I agree with everything said. I do think you need a driver at the end of the day. In your case, you had IP drivers who were sort of synthesizing the information and then making those connections and bring it forward. And I think there is a tendency for us to all get embedded in our own particular area. And the people who really launch companies and things, those are usually people who take the initiative. They take the step, and somebody has to step up to do that. And again, we get so busy with our own things that often things just kind of sit aside for a while. But if you can find someone, whether it's an IP person or just someone who has a lot of energy, to step up and say, this is a really cool thing, let's make it happen. And then I think where the technology sits in, getting back to your original question, you can bring together the information very, very quickly these days through various channels to sort of understand the landscape and figure out the best angles to bring it forward. So the technology's there to make things happen, but you do at the end of the day need someone to own it.
And I think Stanford has a pretty good program with Spark and some of the things that they do to try and bring in entrepreneurs, to try and bring in sort of industry so that effectively you can figure out the right technology, how to put it together. But ultimately, I am a believer, it takes the entrepreneur, it takes the entrepreneurial faculty, but it takes the entrepreneur like Gini to basically integrate things and launch the company. So everything institutions can do to bring those entrepreneurs in, I think makes it much easier for us to think about funding.
So as industry and entrepreneurs come into closer and closer contact, Patrick, how should startups be thinking about the relationship with them and the type of contracts that they ultimately might negotiate if there's a good fit between them to remain VC fundable as they grow and merge?
Yeah, so my general belief for both academia and innovators on that front and entrepreneurs is to have more dialogue than less. Well, before we fund a company, we'll talk to 5 or 6 potential pharmaceutical partners to really understand how they view the technology, what we would need to do in terms of developing the technology to mature it to a level that it's going to be successful. And I would suggest that everybody should do that on the side of, okay, what is the right partnership? How far do I need to advance my technology? You have to be careful about what you disclose. But generally, if you've got a good IP position, you have things nailed out, you're going to get terrific feedback on, okay, I need to do the following to get a Novartis, a Celgene, or a Janssen interested. And ultimately, usually if you can get the pharma interest, you'll get VC interest. Because we'll look at the pharma and say, okay, that's a validation for what this individual entrepreneur is doing. That's a validation for this technology and that approach. And so we'll think about how we can help fund it to basically move it forward. So I think the more dialogue, the better. I do think you need to think when you actually do the partnering and get to the point where you're writing the agreement, think about what you're keeping separate from the pharma so they don't own the company, right? And so, there are a lot of examples of if you've got a broad technology platform like Gini's, you can think about, okay, I'll give you this molecule, but I'm keeping these 2 for myself, and things like that. So there's a lot of things you have to work through specifically on that front. But I generally, back to the question, get really a believer of more dialogue than less for guiding how you build your venture.
Albert, what do you think?
Yeah, as I was thinking about the question, I think that the situation that works best is when you have on both sides, with regards to the original scientific ventures and the entrepreneurs, a collaboration, a lot like you see in academics, where you'll see a paper that's published with 3 different labs involved and they're working together because they all bring their own unique experience. It's the same thing with the company, right? It's an organism where if you get the parts right, you can see amazing things happen. But too often what I can see is that the scientific inventor doesn't give enough credit to the entrepreneur for the spark and the energy that they bring that's so crucial to getting these things off the ground. Sometimes it's the entrepreneur who says, okay, hand it off, it's mine now, right? I know what to do. And the reality is it's never that black and white. So I think just seeing how the people get along and understanding that you have to work complementarily and it's got to be a cooperation model, much like you think about in academics, it's really crucial to getting these companies to be successful.
And from the other side of that question, do you have any advice on that front?
Well, we all, academics all value their work probably 10 times more than it's worth, and VCs always probably underestimate it by tenfold as well, so you somehow have to come together. But I think that's right. I think at the end, if everybody goes in understanding we're on the same team and it's a win-win situation, then it goes very smoothly and very quickly. So I think if you walk into any situation like that, then how do we build this together? And I always found that when I was in the East Coast, that it seemed like there was a lot more of this when you're working with VCs. And out here, to be honest, it's been a lot more pleasant working with VCs. It's just that it's how do we do this together? I think it has been more of a partnership. So there's a little bias thrown out there, but but it's one I've noticed, as I say, in the companies I've founded.
Nice. Jen, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
No, I think I was just going to echo what Patrick said. I think getting validation, for your technology, especially if it's innovative, it's never been done before, getting any sort of validation in the marketplace really helps, and I think can propel getting your venture off the ground. So there are pharma companies that have now set up incubators and accelerators. J&J has got an innovation center. Illumina is setting up an accelerator there. So there are opportunities for scientists in academia to get really working very closely with people in industry, understanding some of their thinking, some of their constraints, and having exposure to that early on, which can help them, advance that research forward to the point where it is now ready for venture. So people should absolutely take advantage of that.
After your IP is filed.
Yes, after your IP is protected.
But I think there's been a shift. I mean, probably 15 years ago, there was a big belief you don't go talk to the pharma until you're way down the path and all of that. And what's happening more now is startups are going to the pharmas first, and pharmas are seeding technologies like at the J&J Innovation Center that we'll then go look at to fund. And so, I think it is, and one of the last Series A deals I did for a company called Mago in the Bay Area, 3 of the pharmas came in and invested alongside of us. And there's much less of a sort of a negative connotation if you take money from Pfizer, if you take money from Merck, that you're beholden to them. It's much more of a view of, as Ginny highlighted, it's a validation of what you're doing, and we view it as such, and that, I think, helps the process. So there's a better collaboration within the community, where there used to be some silos from pharma and venture. It's a lot more collaboration generally.
And I think also what's important is that, this is a comment we had earlier about negative data doesn't get published. And so one of the things that you can really do in having these conversations on a careful basis with pharma is there may be a good chance that people know about something that you've worked on or that's down that pathway that you may not know. And getting that information earlier rather than later can be very helpful to you. But it may not be publicly available. It may never have been published.
Sitting inside the academic realm and seeing the invention disclosures and the big ideas that the professors think are, perhaps much more than they might be, but there's usually a lot of potential there. I think it's that the academics don't necessarily know the next step to take. They don't know, and so it's not even getting to the pharma to go have the conversation with pharma. It's just I want to launch a startup, and so there are incubators. They offer some support and services and a foundation there. But I think that programs like the I-Corps program that NSF is funding now, and I know that the other agencies are picking up on it as well, are trying to get to the level of the grad students, the postdocs, and the faculty who haven't really had this entrepreneurial way of thinking about things, and getting that embedded in sort of their approach to their research at an earlier stage. And I think that will help get them to a point when they do reach out to you guys, that they are in better shape to have better ideas, and they've really thought it through, and they know have a better idea of the sense of their product and the importance and what their invention, where it could lead.
Yeah, the world has changed a lot in that respect. Just even, I mean, every year people are more and more savvy, I think. At the graduate student level, it's not uncommon in the Bay Area, as I'm sure you appreciate, for graduate students to go off and found a company. And that was unheard of when I was a graduate student. So people are more savvy about it now. Filing is very common when people do very interesting things. So,
Still need the training.
but no, I agree with that, and I think actually taking something from, it's one thing to file a patent, and it's another thing to think about what's next and trying to understand the market. That's a big common academic flaw, which is I've got this cool thing, and it may be a widget that's worthless in the real world, but it still gets an academic very excited. So you really have to understand what it is you're building, especially when you're in the tool space as opposed to the therapeutic space.
I think the other thing that I've seen the best communities do is invite. We do a lot of stuff in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Ann Arbor used to be the home of Park Davis, was bought by Pfizer, and so they have a lot of alums there who know a ton about drug development. And so the best, innovators on the faculty will go out and tap into that alumni network who will come in and help them evaluate their opportunity and pull an industry. And if you think about why the Bay Area is so successful, it's largely driven off of those industry academic collaborations. Those happen very easily, very readily. And so anything you can do to facilitate that, and I know we've got a national audience here in your community, I think you'll create a greater success of getting companies off the ground because they've been through the trials of developing drugs. They understand how it happens, and you can end up with a better company.
So you made a really great point about our broader audience here. I think that as people are building companies or thinking about building companies, increasingly these days they're thinking about building them on an international scale, not only working with collaborators in the United States, but abroad as well. And Albert and Patrick, we were speaking a little while back about working with partners in India and China, and some of the questions around how should you navigate the issues of language, technology, and IP that can come up in some of those working relationships.
Yeah, so I think there's actually a pretty well-established infrastructure of service providers in China, for example, WuXi, Kim Partners, and others, where you can outsource certain parts of drug discovery, et cetera. I think also it's been nice, particularly for China, really coming into the world patent enforcement arena, where they actually respect and enforce patents, and in fact, China, I think, files almost as many, if not as many patents per year as the US does. So there is great respect for innovation, and I think either with the right entrepreneur partner, in fact, in some cases, research money is even easier to come by in China today in the life sciences as it is in the US. And so that can create opportunities to have a JV or even establish a subsidiary where maybe that can attract funding in China to de-risk some of the early parts of a company as you're developing the drug in parallel with obviously keeping your US path open as well.
We see that every day at BioWorld. We are frequently writing stories about companies that have found a Chinese partner to fund their research, retain U.S. rights to their work, and then they give the Chinese rights to their partner. And it seems to be a really popular structure these days.
I think the thing you worry about is someone stealing IP. I heard a great story about a company that was about ready to go file their IND with the Chinese regulatory organization, and their competitor came in 2 days before them with a very similar looking IND. And so, in all seriousness, are you worried about your intellectual property getting stolen in that environment? Do you feel like the controls are better, or just interested in the impressions there?
Yeah, so I think this is where it's worth talking to folks who are well practiced in that market in terms of which companies you work with. Obviously, you're working with a large company like a WuXi versus maybe a third tier vendor who may give you a 50% discount, but then you wonder what the 50% came from stealing your technology. So I think that you have to be very careful about who you work with in China, no question about it, but done correctly with folks, particularly folks who are expats who may have been trained here in the US but then go back. There's certain criteria that one can use, common sense really, to who you're going to work with there that are important guidelines to avoid exactly what just happened as you described.
Situations where we've had subawards go to institutes in Brazil, and we had to sort of back up and rethink some of those because in certain countries the IP rights for an invention are with the inventor, the professor, not with the institute they work for. And so then you're dealing with individuals and who might feel very differently about how they want to handle licensing or deal with the corporate funder than if it were at the institute level. So you can't make the assumption that how it's practiced one place is how it's going to be, and there are very different cultural feelings or cultural norms about these academic, corporate, or industry collaborations throughout the world. So again, some people might be ready and willing and wanting to share their technology and their ideas and with a corporate partner, and others not so much. So you really have to understand the subtleties of that before getting into it.
Before I steer us away from IP, I want to ask Susan, when you and I were talking earlier, you brought up the notion of looking at patents and the importance of that for people in early stage research. I just don't want to let that pass. Could you share that with folks?
So it's interesting. So it was a paper that a colleague of mine who's actually here today in the audience, Rashna Ram, she pointed to me out to me a while ago about, it was probably a decade ago, where there was a publication, somebody was making the point that academics should be reading patents just as much as they should be reading research papers. And I think that there's still a huge resistance among graduate students and postdocs to look at patents, and part of it because it's just really difficult to navigate. And so, but there is a lot to be learned from, if you can decipher it, if you can get through it, there are potential applications that you never would have thought of if you're just really looking at from a basic science perspective, or there's a potential application that you might read about that could, if you still really want to look at the core basic research part of it, that might stimulate new ideas that you could then apply for additional federal funding. So it could be a two-way street in what you learn and what you can apply. So we were talking about the importance of the academic community learning how to read through a patent, how to gain the important information and make use of that. But again, it's going to be a certain subset of I think the population who's going to be willing and able to do that. But there's value in it, and I think that you guys would agree in the.
I would iterate, a third of our time is probably spent on patent issues and understanding them. And if I think about sort of the best entrepreneurs, they think about patent problems. One of the worst decisions I ever made was there was a company in Seattle called ZetaRex, and they were basically doing a thing called CAR T therapy. And I looked at their technology, and there were 5 different companies using CD19 vectors for delivering CAR T therapy. Well, I sort of stepped back and said, I'm not going to touch this. And that company became Juno. It's now a $4 billion company. But what happened there was an entrepreneur was insightful enough, and I'll give one of my colleagues, Bob Nelson, credit for putting together IP from MD Anderson, University of Washington, and also the Hutch Cancer Center to basically solve the IP problem. And in doing so, was able to create $4 billion of value. Now, hopefully the company will continue to move forward, but whenever I think about IP problems, I think about the important part of not just thinking about your position, but thinking about who else is out there that has an interesting IP position on the space, and how do I bring that IP together to create a dominant estate. I mean, Alnylam did the same thing about 10, 15 years ago in RNAi. And so, I would always think about the patent questions on what else is out there, how do I bring it together to create a dominant position and not be too focused on my individual institution and what exists here, but can I go out and pull together to create, much, much stronger
And working
IP.
with the IP firms. So we had one firm handling all of the patents for the EBI, whether they were coming out of the University of Illinois, Lawrence Berkeley Lab, or our campus. And so that, I think, was really important. And a lot of the students or the postdocs would come back and they would be interested in reading the patents, and they would want to know how they could modify their research plan to maybe try and bring in a different aspect, to invent around, or to come up with something novel. And so it can drive them to think about things in a different way, and could turn out to be very beneficial.
Before the panel, I sat down with the Wall Street Journal coffee shop across the street, and I did something which usually makes my blood boil as I read the opinion page. And it was an editorial by Jeb Bush, and it was really interesting. He wrote that we're a nation of free men and women who are capable of achieving far more than liberals and regulators believe possible. So he was talking about burdensome regulation, and I guess I was wondering, Mike, I think of you as being really out there on the edge of things. Do we need to tango with burdensome regulation to sort of clear the path to truly take the next leap in innovation, or are we kind of doing okay on that front, do you think?
Well, the mind is never constrained, so you can always think of lots of wonderful ideas to do. I guess there are times when you wonder, there are plenty of controversial things out there, like getting your genome sequenced without being counseled and things like that. There's some regulations are meant to help people, and some you kind of wonder about. I think there's plenty of space out there to move around and navigate without running into too many regulations, but there always seems to be a time or two where you bump into something, you kind of scratch your head and wonder why that rule wasn't there. And I always find it amazing that, for example, when we discover things in the lab about a particular person, we can't give that information back to the person because we're very constrained, and all the hoops you have to go through to try and do that actually makes it de-incentivizes it. So that's a case where I think regulation can be very obstructive. So again, it probably depends on the particular space you're in. So.
Anybody else want to touch the third rail?
I think from an FDA and other perspective in the life sciences industry, it's gotten a lot better. I've seen a lot more receptivity and a lot better progressive movement, and particularly in areas where we have severe issues like anti-infectives, where 100,000 people are being killed from hospital-based MRSA infections a year, and the FDA is saying, understand it's a small market, but if you develop something here, we'll give you 10 years exclusivity and a bunch of economic incentives to do that. So I would generally say within our sector, there's been a lot more positive aspects. I would say that's true for therapeutics. On therapeutic devices, it's been much more challenging, and a lot of the venture funding's dried up in that area. Now, there could be a long argument about whether that's justified or not. There's clearly been a lot of things the manufacturers have done which haven't been terrific, but I would say on the therapeutic side, it's been very positive regulatory environment over the past 5 to 10 years.
But in the end, I think a lot of this is driven, for better or for worse, by public opinion. I mean, 10 years ago, things looked absolutely horrendous when Vioxx was pulled off the market and the FDA was being hauled up in front of Congress saying, how could you approve this drug that only helps with pain and it causes heart attacks? I mean, there's no right answer. There's not a good answer to that question. So I think the benefit of the last 10 years is the FDA stopped approving new medicines for things like cancer, infectious disease, rare diseases where you can save people's lives, and people have said, that's no good. So that's helped bring that sentiment back. But for example, the diagnostic space, which I think has actually had some challenges with regards to what FDA wants to regulate, public opinion will actually sway, for better or for worse, the politicians on their decision making.
When I think about the energy biosciences space, I think of things in flip terms from therapeutics, where regulation is encouraging to your work. Always, most of the time.
I think it's different in that, in one fell swoop, you can come and knock out a complete, let's say, biofuel industry if you decide to repeal a renewable fuel standard. And so there are different drivers, I think, than what you face in sort of therapeutics or healthcare. I think maybe that's more in reaction to a bad trial or some outcome, whereas in biofuels, it's an economic decision. It's price of oil is at $50 a barrel again, so we're going to repeal the RFS and put back these other initiatives, and so that can change the market. It can cause shifts in the market pretty drastically, but it's not as much it's very different, but different drivers, and I think like one fell swoop and you sort of approach to damaging the industry.
But maybe backing up a little bit to the life sciences, I do think working with the FDA, most people tell you that if while you're going through the process of that, no matter what you do, whether it's diagnostics or therapeutics, trying to work with the FDA is always a better approach than trying to work outside the system and then reconnect. So I think trying to go with the regulations as you go is better.
Yeah, it's much better to ask for permission than forgiveness from the FDA, because if you're asking for forgiveness from the FDA, you're in real trouble.
So with just about 5 minutes left here, I want to give you each an opportunity to sort of add any closing thoughts to. I know our discussion has been pretty crazy, wide-ranging, but are there any sort of ties that that you want to bring, or any things that we haven't touched on that you want to bring up? Albert?
Well, I mean, I think actually something Gini said, which was that she was doing her PhD during a time where the genomic revolution was occurring, and we're actually just now starting to see the fruit of that. I mean, I know it's been 15 years, but it's quite remarkable. I mean, the pathways being elucidated, the benefit of diagnostics, proteomics, pharmacogenomics, and big data, it's pretty remarkable. So I think we're at a really unique time, and I think it speaks to everybody here in the room and also the people remotely as well, that hopefully there'll be an opportunity for tools like Project Neon, which we're going to hear about, to help catalyze more innovation faster at a time where I think there's a lot that we can do.
Yeah, I mean, I'll second that. I just think it is an amazing time. I think also people are just incredibly savvy these days, and I wonder, it used to be you studied for a PhD, one gene, one PhD. And these days it might be one genome, one PhD, and pretty soon it might be one PhD, one company coming out of this. So, and I think that's quite plausible in this particular area where people really do think very creatively and about how to apply what they're doing. So it'll be fun to see how this all progresses.
So I think I would take it back to sort of what we opened with, was breaking down silos. I think that really, striving for interdisciplinary research programs and collaborations is very important. And I think to levels that, we can all say that, and there are a lot of institutes at every major university that say, oh, we're an interdisciplinary institute of blah, blah, blah. And I've seen very few that actually can demonstrate what that really means. And so it used to be before that bio and informatics was interdisciplinary, and now that's a discipline, and so that doesn't count anymore. Bioenergy, maybe 8 years ago, it was a combination, but in the 8 years we've really managed to get the chemical engineers to talk the bio language, and the biologists to understand what's involved in refining and what and where you need to go, and understand the scale and the scope. So I think that keeping that moving in the right direction is really will be critical. And
Jenny?
I would say I would echo what Albert and Mike said. We are living in a very exciting time. There's lots and lots of change coming, especially in the life sciences industry, and I'd say embrace it. I mean, there's just more interesting stuff that's going to come out in this decade than in probably the last several decades that we've seen. So anyone in the audience who may be looking at what to train in, given all these changes that are happening, I think look for opportunities where you can train in multiple disciplines. I think those sorts of careers are always going to be in demand. So that's where innovation's headed, and you can sort of shoot to where the puck's going to be.
I've been struck in this conversation, and just over the past couple of years, how technologies that were quote unquote dead, like gene therapy, have sort of come into their own. And so I think some of the most interesting opportunities in the life sciences sector are revisiting technologies that may not have worked previously, but because of innovations on delivery, innovations on computational power, innovations on sequencing getting down to $2,000 or whatever it costs, $1,000 a genome, will enable to make something work that didn't work before. And some of the great companies in CAR-T and other areas are coming out of that, and I would encourage people to think about those and how you can create new opportunities from things that were, make a phoenix rise out of the ashes.
Well, I think we need to leave it there. I am going to invite you all to stick around to ask questions of our panelists during our networking afterwards, and the rest of you viewing this online to join us online as well. Patricia is here to tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for a very interesting discussion ranging from really collaboration, connections, innovation, and the rapid pace of change that we're all experiencing. As Michael said, we're not going to have a formal Q&A discussion either in person or online now, but we're going to invite all of you to take this conversation, take these threads around IP management, around rediscovering some therapies or diagnostic tools or research that may not have been fully exploited yet, and take that discussion into Project Neon. Project Neon is our new platform, just released in beta, and we're delighted to be sharing it with you today. And our panelists have agreed to begin discussions on there, to lead some conversations, to explore the content. And in line with a couple of themes here around opening up content and opening up research discoveries, part of our goal with Project Neon is to use not necessarily new technologies, but technologies, social technologies, social tools to help all the participants in these ecosystems to discover research in new ways and to collaborate together in new ways and to hopefully innovate more expeditiously and more successfully. So thank you. Thank you again to our panelists, and we look forward to the conversation. We will be having a competition as it relates to Project Neon. It will run through October, and the maybe rather vague but very interesting, there will be a prize for the most innovative and engaging conversations on there. So we look forward to talking to you further in that venue. Thank you, and a round of applause for our panelists. And now let me let you know there's some drinks and opportunities to delve into further questions on your innovation story with the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.